The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was nursing my third cup of coffee and staring at another day of remote programming work from my cramped Chicago apartment. Subject line: unique property opportunity, entire mining town, Colorado. I almost deleted it as spam until I saw the price. $12,000 for an entire town. Not a house, not a lot. An entire abandoned mining settlement called Millfield. Population 0. Elevation 9,400 feet. Nestled in the San Juan Mountains. My name is David Chen. And 3 months ago, I was just another burned-out software developer drowning in city rent and longing for something different. The pandemic had shown me I could work from anywhere. So when I saw that listing, something inside me sparked. $12,000 wasn't even 2 months' rent in Chicago. The listing came with photos of weathered wooden buildings, a main street straight out of a Western movie, and mountains that took my breath away even through my laptop screen. The real estate agent, a gruff-voiced man named Earl Hutchins, was surprisingly straightforward when I called him. "Look, son, I'll be honest with you. Most folks who inquire about Millfield get cold feet pretty quick. It's remote. It's got no utilities running to it, and winter up there can be brutal. But the land is solid, the buildings are structurally sound, and if you're looking for privacy, you won't find better this side of Alaska." I asked him why it was so cheap. Earl paused for a long moment before answering. The mining company went belly up in 1987. Town's been empty ever since. Previous owner was some investment group from Denver that never did anything with it. They just wanted off their books. 3 weeks later, I was driving my loaded Honda Civic up Highway 550, past Durango, watching civilization fade away mile by mile. The final 20 miles to Millfield weren't even on Google Maps. Earl had sent me hand-drawn directions that felt like something from a treasure hunt. Follow the old mining road past Needleton. When you see the rusted bridge, you're 5 miles out. Can't miss it. He was right. I couldn't miss it. Millfield sat in a natural bowl between the ridges, as if the mountains had cupped their hands to hold it. The main street ran for maybe 300 yards, lined with false front buildings that looked like movie sets. A general store, a saloon called the Nugget, what appeared to be a hotel, and at the far end, sitting on a small rise overlooking everything, a white wooden church with a bell tower that pierced the thin mountain air. I parked in front of what? The deed listed as the mayor's house, a 2-story Victorian that would be my new home. The silence hit me first, not the quiet of suburbs or even the country, but true silence. No traffic, no neighbors mowing lawns, no distant highway hum. Just wind through the buildings and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Earl met me at the house, having driven up from Durango to hand over the keys. He was exactly what I'd pictured from his voice, weathered face, cowboy hat, boots that had seen real work. We walked through the property together, him pointing out the main buildings, the old mine shaft openings sealed with steel grates, the creek that ran behind the town providing fresh water, generator sheds over there, he said, pointing to a metal building. Previous caretaker left a good diesel unit. Should keep you powered up fine. Propane tanks for heat and cooking. You'll want to stock up before winter hits. As we walked, I noticed Earl kept glancing toward the church. Finally, I asked about it. Double quote, so that, well, it's part of your property now. Built in 1889, same year as most of the town. Congregation used to be the whole population. Give or take. He shifted uncomfortably. Haven't been inside it myself in, must be 15 years now. Is there a problem with the building? Structural issues? Earl stopped walking and looked directly at me. Son, I'm going to give you some advice, and I hope you'll take it. There are folks in the valley below, in Hermosa Creek Settlement, about 10 miles down the mountain. Good people. If you need supplies, company, or help with anything, they'll set you right. But if you're smart, you'll ask them about the church before you go poking around in there. I laughed, thinking he was being overly dramatic about an old building. Come on, Earl. What's the big deal? Bats? Structural damage? His expression didn't change. Just ask the folks in Hermosa Creek first. Promise me that. The way he said it made my smile fade. I nodded. After Earl left, I spent the rest of the day moving my stuff into the house and getting oriented. The Victorian was in better shape than I'd expected. Hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, and enough room for me to set up a proper office. The previous caretaker had left behind some basic furniture and supplies, and the generator hummed to life on the first try. As evening approached, I walked the main street, taking photos to send to friends back home. The buildings were like something from a museum. The general store still had shelves stocked with decades-old canned goods and mining supplies. The saloon had tables and chairs arranged as if customers might walk in any moment. Everything was preserved in mountain air and isolation. I saved the church for last, up close. It was beautiful in the way only old craftsmanship can be. Hand-carved details around the windows, a solid oak door with iron hinges, and that bell tower reaching toward peaks that caught the last light of sunset. I tried the door, but it was locked. Peering through the windows, I could see wooden pews and a simple altar. Nothing obviously wrong or dangerous. That night, I called my sister, Emma, in Denver. "So how's life as a ghost town mayor?" she joked. "It's incredible, Em. You should see this place. It's like stepping back in time. And you're really not freaked out being alone up there." I looked out my window at the empty street. Buildings silhouetted against star-filled sky. Actually, it's peaceful. I've gotten more work done today than I did all last week in Chicago. "Well, just promise me you'll check in regularly if you go all Jack Torrance on me. I'm sending a search party." The next morning, I decided to take Earl's advice and drive down to Hermosa Creek. The settlement turned out to be a cluster of newer log homes and cabins scattered along a valley floor. I found the general store, a place called Mountain Supply, run by a woman named Ruth Martinez. Ruth was friendly enough when I introduced myself as the new owner of Millfield, but her expression changed when I mentioned it. "You bought the whole town?" She shook her head. "Lord have mercy. How much did they tell you about the place?" "Not much. The mining company went under in '87. Been empty since." "Why, is there something I should know?" Ruth busied herself restocking shelves, not meeting my eyes. "Millfield's got a history, honey. Not all of it good." "What kind of history?" She sighed and leaned against the counter. "My grandmother lived through it. Said the mine wasn't the only thing that went dark up there." I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "There was a preacher back in the '80s, man named Reverend Mordecai Pike. Came to town just before things went bad. Real fire and brimstone type, but something off about him. Grandmother said he had ideas about salvation that didn't sit right with folks." "What kind of ideas?" "The kind that got people hurt." Ruth finally looked at me directly. "Look, I don't know if any of the old stories are true, but I know that church up there, people stopped going to services. Families started leaving town even before the mine shut down. And after Pike disappeared, well, nobody wanted to set foot in that building again." A chill ran down my spine, remembering Earl's warning. What happened to Pike? Nobody knows. One day he was there. Next day he wasn't. Some say he left town. Others, she trailed off. Others what? Others say he never left at all. I drove back to Millfield with Ruth's words echoing in my head. The church looked different now, less picturesque and more ominous against the mountain backdrop. That evening, I did some research online, but information about small mining towns was sparse. One found a few references to Millfield in historical documents, mentions of silver strikes and boom times, but nothing about any Reverend Pike or unusual events in the 1980s. Over the next week, I fell into a routine. Work in the mornings, explore the town in the afternoons, read by the fire in the evenings. The isolation that had worried my friends back home became my favorite thing about the place. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no distractions, just me, my work, and the mountains. But I kept finding myself drawn to the church. Every evening walk ended with me standing at its front door, trying to peer through the windows. The building seemed to watch me back, if that makes sense, during the day. It looked like any other old church, but at dusk, when shadows stretched long across the main street, something about it felt wrong. On my 8th day in Millfield, I decided to find a way inside. The front door was solid and locked, but old buildings always have their weak points. I walked around the perimeter and found a basement window on the north side. Partially hidden by overgrown brush, the glass was broken, leaving just enough space for someone to squeeze through. I should have remembered Earl's warning. I should have thought about Ruth's story. But curiosity won out over caution, and I found myself clearing away the brush and peering into the dark basement. Below, the smell hit me first, not decay or mold, like you'd expect in an old basement, but something else, something organic and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. I shined my flashlight through the opening and saw a stone floor, wooden support beams, and what looked like shelving. Along the walls, getting through the window was awkward but manageable. I dropped down into the basement and immediately knew I'd made a mistake. The smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. My flashlight beam revealed that what I'd taken for shelving was actually something else entirely: wooden coffins. Dozens of them, arranged in neat rows along 3 walls of the basement. My hands shook as I swept the flashlight beam across the scene. Some coffins were clearly old. They were darkened with age. Others looked newer, their surfaces still showing. The marks of recent construction. All of them were closed, but several had brass nameplates that gleamed in my flashlight beam. I moved closer to read the names, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Elizabeth Morrison, 1885 to 1913. James Mitchell, 1891 to 1923. Sarah Pike, 1901 to 1987. Pike, the same name Ruth had mentioned. Reverend Mordecai Pike. I continued reading names and dates, noting that many of the deaths seemed clustered around certain years. The 1890s showed a lot of deaths, which made sense for a rough mining town. But then there was another cluster in the 1940s, another in the 1960s, and a final group in the 1980s. That's when I found a coffin that made my blood freeze. Reverend Mordecai Pike, 1943 to 1987. The date of death was 1987, the same year the town was abandoned. But what made me stumble backward was the condition of the coffin itself. Unlike the others, this one showed signs of damage, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had clawed at it from the inside. The brass nameplate was bent and scratched, and when I looked closer, I could see that the coffin lid was slightly askew. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that basement, out of the church. Maybe out of Millfield entirely, but I couldn't stop myself from approaching Pike's coffin. The gap between the lid and the base was just wide enough to see inside. I raised my flashlight and peered into the opening. The coffin was empty, not just empty of a body, but completely empty. No lining, no pillow, nothing. Just bare wood stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. That's when I heard the footsteps above. Slow, deliberate steps across the wooden floor of the church sanctuary. Step, pause, as if someone was walking carefully between the pews. I stood frozen, flashlight clutched in my trembling hand, listening to those impossible footsteps directly over my head. The church had been locked. I'd checked it myself multiple times. There was no way anyone could be inside. But the footsteps continued, growing closer to where I estimated the altar would be. Then they stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my skin crawl, singing. A low, wordless humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it. It sounded like a hymn played backward, or a lullaby sung by something that didn't quite understand how human voices worked. I backed toward the broken window, my escape route, but stopped when my flashlight beam caught something I'd missed before. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind the rows of coffins, was a wooden door. It was newer than everything else down there, and unlike the coffins, it looked recently used. The door handle was brass, polished to a shine, and there was no dust on the frame. Against every rational thought in my head, I approached the door. The singing above grew louder, and I could swear I heard words now, though in no language I recognized. My hand reached for the door handle almost of its own accord. The brass was warm to the touch, which made no sense in the cold basement air. As I turned the handle, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. The door opened inward, revealing a tunnel carved into the mountain itself. The walls were smooth stone, and the floor was worn smooth as if by countless footsteps. My flashlight beam disappeared into darkness, unable to find the end of the passage. But what made me step back in horror was what I saw carved into the stone. Arch above the tunnel entrance, symbols that hurt to look at, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And below the symbols, carved in more familiar letters, was a single word: salvation. The singing started again, but this time it was coming from the tunnel. Not just one voice, but many, harmonizing in that same backwards hymn. The sound echoed off the stone walls, growing louder and more urgent, as if calling me forward. I ran. I scrambled up to the broken window, hauled myself through, and sprinted across the main street to my house. Once inside, I locked every door and window, then sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Old mining town probably had a cemetery somewhere. Maybe the church basement was used for storage before burial. The footsteps could have been the building settling. The singing could have been wind through the old structure. But I knew what I'd heard, and that tunnel. There was no innocent explanation for a hidden passage carved into the mountain beneath a church. I called Ruth at Mountain Supply the next morning. "Ruth, it's David from Millfield. I need to ask you about Reverend Pike." There was a long pause. "You went into the church, didn't you?" "How did you?" "Because you're the first person to call me sounding terrified since the last fool. Who tried to live up there? What did you find?" I told her about the basement, the coffins, the tunnel. Ruth listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother told me stories," she said finally. "Said Pike came to town preaching about a different kind of salvation, not the heavenly kind. He claimed there was a way to avoid death entirely, to achieve immortality through sacrifice and devotion. Most folks thought he was just another crazy preacher, but people started disappearing. Not leaving town, disappearing, and Pike's congregation kept growing. Even though nobody remembered joining, Grandmother said the people who attended his services weren't quite right afterward, like something had been taken out of them." What happened to Pike? According to Grandmother, the remaining townspeople confronted him in 1987, found evidence that he'd been collecting people. The mine shut down that same year. But it wasn't economics, it was fear. People fled Millfield like it was cursed. But Pike died in 1987. I saw his coffin. Ruth's laugh was bitter. "Honey, just because there's a coffin with his name on it doesn't mean he's dead." Grandmother always said Pike found what he was looking for, his version of salvation. That afternoon, I tried to work but couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, I'd find myself looking toward the church, expecting to see movement in the windows or a figure in the bell tower. The building dominated my view from the house, and I was beginning to understand why the previous owners had been so eager to sell. As evening approached, I made a decision. I couldn't live with the mystery eating at me. I needed to know what was in that tunnel, even if the knowledge destroyed any chance of staying in Millfield. I waited until full dark, then returned to the church with a better flashlight, spare batteries, and my phone set to record video. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence. The basement felt different at night, colder, and that organic smell was stronger. The coffins seemed to press closer together, creating a maze of shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. Pike's damaged coffin gaped open like a mouth, and I gave it a wide berth as I approached the tunnel door. The brass handle was still warm. The carved symbols above the entrance seemed to writhe in my flashlight beam, and looking at them too long gave me a headache. But I forced myself forward, into the tunnel that disappeared into the mountain's heart. The passage sloped gently downward, and I could see that it had been carved with tools, not natural erosion. Every few feet, small alcoves had been cut into the walls, and in each alcove sat objects that made my skin crawl. Dolls with human hair, jewelry that looked valuable but somehow wrong, photographs of people I didn't recognize, all with their eyes scratched out, and bones, human bones, arranged in careful patterns that suggested ritual purpose. The tunnel continued for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted. By the stone walls, and underneath my own movements, I could swear I heard other footsteps, matching my pace but slightly out of sync. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast natural cavern. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls, but what I could see made me wish I'd never left Chicago. The cavern had been converted into a massive underground church. Stone pews carved from the living rock faced a raised altar at the far end. But these weren't normal church pews. Each one was occupied. Dozens of figures sat in perfect rows, facing the altar. They were motionless, heads bowed as if in prayer. At first glance, they looked like normal people, men, women, children, all dressed in clothes spanning decades of fashion. But as I moved closer, my flashlight revealed the truth. They were mummified, preserved somehow in the cold, dry air of the cavern. Their skin was leathery and dark, their hair brittle, but their eyes were still open, still aware. They tracked my movement as I passed, though their heads never moved. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. These were Pike's congregation, the people who had disappeared over the decades. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either, trapped in some horrible state between life and death, forever attending a service that would never end. That's when I heard the voice, "Welcome, brother." I spun around, flashlight sweeping the cavern, and saw him. Reverend Mordecai Pike stood at the altar, exactly as he must have looked in life, tall and gaunt, with long gray hair and eyes that burned with fanatic fervor. He wore a simple black suit and clerical collar, both somehow untouched by time. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. "Ever since you arrived in our blessed town, I've felt your presence, your need for something greater than the empty existence you left behind. You're dead," I managed to say. "You died in 1987. Pike smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "Death is an illusion, brother, a lie told by those who lack faith. I have found true salvation, eternal life in service to powers greater than any earthly understanding." He gestured to his congregation of mummies. "These faithful souls have joined me in everlasting worship. No more pain, no more fear, no more death, only eternal devotion and the promise of rewards beyond mortal comprehension. They're not alive," I said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "You've turned them into monsters." "Monsters?" Pike's laugh was like glass breaking. "I've given them exactly what every human secretly desires: immortality, purpose, freedom from the tyranny of time itself." One of the mummified figures in the front pew turned its head to look at me directly. Its mouth opened, revealing a black void where its tongue should be, and it spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "Join us," it whispered. "It's so peaceful here. No more worry, no more pain." Others began to turn, their preserved faces focusing on me with hungry attention. "Join us," they repeated in unison, their voices creating a horrible chorus. "Stay with us forever." Pike raised his hands, and the congregation rose as one. "You see, brother, they want you to experience their joy, to share in their eternal reward." The mummified figures began shuffling toward me, moving with jerky, unnatural movements. I turned and ran for the tunnel, their voices following me like a wave. "Don't leave us," they called. "We're so lonely. Stay and worship with us forever." I sprinted through the tunnel, my flashlight beam dancing wildly off the walls. Behind me, I could hear them coming, their footsteps creating a sound like rainfall on autumn leaves. The ritual objects in the alcoves seemed to reach out as I passed, and I swear I felt fingers brush my jacket. I reached the basement and scrambled toward the broken window, but found my way blocked. More figures stood between me and my escape route. These were different from the congregation in the cavern, fresher, people who must have been taken more recently. "Please," one of them said, and I recognized the voice. It was Earl Hutchins, the real estate agent who had sold me the property. But his eyes were empty, his skin already taking on that leathery texture. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Reverend Pike just wants to help you find salvation." More voices joined his, all pleading in that same hollow tone. "It's not so bad. You get used to it. The hunger stops after a while." I looked around desperately and spotted a section of the basement wall. where the stones looked loose. Without thinking, I charged toward it, using my shoulder as a battering ram. The old mortar gave way, and I crashed through into another tunnel, this one leading upward. I crawled through the narrow passage, guided only by a faint current of air that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. Behind me, I could hear Pike's voice, no longer gentle and persuasive. "You cannot escape salvation, brother. The mountain itself serves our cause. Every tunnel leads back to us." The passage opened into another basement, this one under what must have been the general store. I found stairs leading up and burst through a door into the main floor of the store. Through the windows, I could see my house across the street, but between me and safety stood more of Pike's congregation. They filled the street. Dozens of mummified figures in clothes from different eras. All of them turned to look at me as I emerged from the store. "David," one of them called, and I saw it was Ruth Martinez from Mountain Supply. Half of her face was already preserved, the other half still showing signs of recent life. "Why are you fighting this? I'm so much happier now, no more worry about the store, no more bills to pay, just eternal peace." I backed into the store, looking for another exit, but found only more tunnels. Pike's voice echoed from the basement behind me. "Every building in Millfield is connected, brother. We've had decades to prepare. There is no escape, only acceptance." That's when I realized the truth. The entire town was a trap. Pike and his congregation hadn't been confined to the church. They'd been expanding, digging, converting Millfield into a massive underground complex designed to capture and convert anyone who dared to live there. The previous owners hadn't abandoned the property because of economics. They'd fled because they'd discovered what lived beneath their feet. I made a desperate decision. The general store had a back door that led to the creek behind the town. If I could reach my car, I might be able to escape before the entire congregation could surround me. I burst through the back door and ran toward the creek, jumping over the water and scrambling up the slope toward where I'd parked my Honda. Behind me, I could hear them emerging from buildings all along the main street. Not just the mummified congregation, but other things. Shapes that moved wrong, made sounds that no human throat could produce. My car started on the first try, and I floored the accelerator, racing down the mountain road without looking back. In my rearview mirror, I could see figures standing in the street, watching me go, and among them, tall and unmistakable even at distance, stood Reverend Mordecai Pike. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the Denver airport. 3 days later, I was back in Chicago, back in my cramped apartment, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of altitude-induced hallucination. But the video on my phone told a different story. Shaky footage of the tunnel, the cavern, Pike's congregation, and at the very end, a clear shot of Earl Hutchins' face, half preserved, pleading with me to stay. I called the county sheriff's office to report what I'd found. But when they sent deputies to investigate, they found nothing. According to their report, Millfield was exactly what it appeared to be, an abandoned mining town with empty buildings, and no signs of recent habitation. The church basement, they said, contained nothing but old mining equipment and a few broken coffins from a cemetery that had been moved decades ago. No tunnel, no underground complex, no preserved congregation. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know that Pike's offer still stands. Every night, I dream about that cavern, about eternal worship and freedom from mortal concerns. The dreams are getting stronger, more persuasive. Sometimes I catch myself researching flights to Denver, looking up rental cars, planning the drive back to Millfield. Part of me wonders if Pike was right, if what he offered really was salvation. Of a sort, the dreams show me Ruth, Earl, and all the others. They look peaceful, content in their eternal service. No more bills, no more job stress, no more loneliness. Just endless worship in a place where time has no meaning. I've put the property back on the market, but the listing keeps getting taken down. Every real estate agent I contact says the same thing. There's no record of any property sale in Millfield. No deed in my name, no evidence that I ever owned anything there. It's as if the transaction never happened, as if Pike's influence extends far beyond the mountains of Colorado. But I still have the key, a simple brass key that Earl gave me which fits doors that apparently don't exist. And every morning when I wake up, I find myself holding it, as if my sleeping mind had been reaching for it in the dark. Last night, I dreamed that I was driving back up that mountain road. In the dream, the congregation was waiting for me on the main street, their preserved faces welcoming and patient. Pike stood at their head, arms spread wide in invitation, ready to come home. "Brother," he asked Dot, and for the first time since escaping. "Millfield," I answered. "Yes. I'm writing this as a warning, but also as a confession. By the time anyone reads this, I'll probably be gone. The pull is too strong now, and the promises Pike made are starting to sound less like threats and more like offers of genuine peace. If you ever see a listing for property in Millfield, Colorado, don't be tempted by the price. Don't think you can handle the isolation, and whatever you do, don't listen to the singing that comes from the church basement. Some forms of salvation aren't worth the cost. The plane to Denver leaves in 3 hours. I've already packed my bag and printed my boarding pass. The brass key sits on my desk, warm to the touch despite the cold morning air. I can hear them calling me home.